Welcome to my lecture. Today, I'm going to talk about the plight of newspapers in most Western countries, what I usually call the old media. I'll talk about threats to their viability from the internet and threats to the profession of journalism from the new citizen journalism. Along the way, I'll discuss another threatened species, the editor. I'll explain why the survival of newspapers is important to a democratic society and why local reporting is so important. I'll conclude by making a case for a new revenue model for newspapers if they are to survive. So let's begin. Newspapers are ailing. Just 20 years ago, major newspapers were profitable. They were the main source of in-depth news and analysis, major shapers of public opinion, and they had large readerships which allowed them to rake in advertising dollars. For it has always been advertising rather than the newsstand price of newspapers that made the money. Over the last 20 years, paper after paper has disappeared. Those that remain are often a shadow of what they used to be, having cut staff to the bone, reduced their staff, and reduce their depth of coverage. In the process, they have lost readership and the advertising revenue that depends on having lots of readers. The reasons are complex, but one factor is that many people now get their news from the internet's news aggregators. I'll spell that. A-G-G-R-E-G-A-T-O-R-S. News aggregators. So what are these? Well, they are web applications which aggregate or collect internet content, such as online newspapers, in one location for easy viewing. They collect information from various news sources. They have two advantages over the printed press. The first is they are continually updated so that the news is always fresh. Newspapers, in contrast, must wait until the next edition to include breaking news. Secondly, they can save readers time and effort. Instead of looking in several places, a reader might go to only one place. Examples of this sort of website are Google News, Drudge Report, and the Huffington Post. You don't need to write these down, but you may be familiar with some of them. Many of these sites are making good money. The Huffington Post, for example, is extremely successful. However, the newspapers that produce the content are not seeing much of the money. So this lecture is not going to be a rant against the internet. The internet is a marvellous tool, but so far it has not delivered much original reporting. Instead, it sucks reporting out of mainstream news publications, out of traditional print journalism, from newspapers and magazines. Aggregating websites and bloggers do not add much value to what they take. They repeat and reproduce, and maybe they add some commentary. Of course, it's much easier to click on Google News from a browser than to go to the Sydney Morning Herald, the Washington Post, or to a local city newspaper. The worry is that readers are acquiring news from aggregators and abandoning where it came from, namely the newspapers themselves. So the readers and subscribers are disappearing and the advertising dollars are also going. The money is going to the aggregators instead. Now, there are many that say this is the beauty of the internet, that information is free, that anyone can access it. Of course, it's nice to get stuff for free, but it costs money to produce quality journalism and someone has to pay for it. And it's also said that the internet is inherently democratic in that it allows everyone to have a voice. Some people have hailed the internet for ushering in a new age of democracy. Anyone can start a website or write a blog. And this is where the citizen journalist comes in. You may have heard this phrase before. The citizen journalist is any average person who can go out and research and investigate and publish stories in blogs or on sites like the Huffington Post. You or I can be citizen journalists. Many traditional publications are making use of these citizen journalists, and some internet publications use them exclusively. Some say this is the future of journalism. I do not agree. To begin with, the quality of blogs is highly variable. Many of them are rampantly ideological. That is, they push a set of extreme beliefs. They do not pretend to be even-handed. They are quite consciously promoting a one-sided agenda. Many are ridiculously inaccurate, and others are just juvenile. Some of them are also quite good, even original. But what is missing from citizen journalism is the professionalism of the full-time journalist. Let me give you an example. The typical reporter on a city newspaper knows his or her city and the people who are the sources of good stories. They spend a lot of time hanging out in their beats. That is, the places where stories can be found. But you do not run into bloggers and citizen journalists in these places. You don't see them at City Hall, or in the hallways of the courthouse, or in the bars where police officers gather. These are the places where public officials who know what's going on and who know about corrupt and illegal behaviour can be found. You don't see them constantly nurturing and then pressing their sources for information. You don't see them holding institutions accountable on a daily basis. You don't see them monitoring public officials and asking the hard questions to make sure that they are serving the public and not their private interests. Why not? Because high-end journalism is a profession. It requires daily, full-time commitment by trained men and women who return to the same beats day in and day out. Reporting is a tough job. It takes training, guidance and experience to qualify as a working journalist. That does not happen overnight. Not everyone who tries succeeds. I prefer to call those who think they are citizen journalists accidental journalists, especially those who call themselves photojournalists because they happen to get a useful photo by being in the right place at the right time. Most citizens who hope to be journalists are untrained. They work on instinct, usually with hardly a day in the field, and have never had to cover a breaking story. Part-time, unpaid citizen journalists are simply not able to take over the role of monitoring our local governments, our police departments, our unions and corporations. This monitoring, which is essential to the maintenance of a free and open society. So, I've explained why I believe professional journalists are essential and why it's naive to expect that they can be replaced by part-time amateur citizen journalists. Now, I want to say a word about editors. Now, editors are the gatekeepers of journalism. The editor's job is to impose standards that make for good journalism. I know that many who attack mainstream media, traditional media, are not impressed by the gatekeeper concept. They believe that good, accurate and true journalism will find its own level without interference, that we don't need editors between the writer and the reader. These people live in a dream world. Editors are crucial to journalism. They do not always succeed. They do not always satisfy everyone they edit. This does not mean we should eliminate them. They serve an important function of holding up a stop sign when needed. They ask questions. They get answers. They often make the unreadable readable. Mainstream media has its faults, but if we are not careful, age-old standards that still apply will be lost forever. Okay, now let's turn to local newspapers, those that cover particular cities and regions. These papers are in the greatest trouble. The stories that they cover may not be that thrilling for a national audience, but they are important because democracy starts from the ground up. It matters if a local council decides to rezone an area from residential to commercial purposes so that developers can profit. But we don't tend to see reporters from national newspapers at local government meetings. There's no glory in this kind of journalism, but it is the bedrock, the foundation of journalism. Without aggressive reporters keeping an eye on local authorities, the next 10 to 15 years are going to be a golden age for corrupt politicians. Effective, well-funded local newspapers are essential for ensuring that public officials are behaving honestly and not making off with public money. Finally, we come back to money. As I've reiterated often in this lecture, nothing happens without money. The industry is going to have to find a way to charge for online content. I've heard the cry that information wants to be free, but information isn't free. It costs money to send reporters to London, to Fallujah, to Capitol Hill, and to send photographers with them, to keep them there day after day. It costs money to hire the best investigators and writers, and then back them up with the best editors. And how anyone can believe that the industry can fund this kind of expense by giving its product away online to aggregators and bloggers is a mystery to me. Any marketing major can tell you that if you don't have a product you can charge for, then you don't actually have a product at all. If governments are serious about preserving newspapers, they should consider non-profit status for newspapers. As non-profit bodies, newspapers' profits would not be taxed. Secondly, copyright will have to be protected from aggregators. Intellectual property must be protected. Thirdly, the industry should move to a paid online subscriber base. Unlimited access to content can't be given away free. This does mean that readers will have to return to paying for what they read. In a sense, this transition has already been made for music, with applications like iTunes that send some money back to the producers of content, that is, the singers, musicians, and songwriters. So there you have it. My very personal views on where newspapers are at and what they need to survive. They are bleeding money because they have lost their readers, and with them their advertising streams to, among other things, news aggregators. Citizen journalism, despite what some say, is not the answer. Quality journalism requires trained professionals, and it takes more than goodwill and a camera to be one. A new business model is urgently required, and governments can do their part by offering newspapers tax concessions and intellectual property protection.